October 15, 2018. Maplewood, New Jersey, a quiet, picturesque town nestled just a short drive from the hustle and bustle of New York City. Known for its charming neighborhoods, friendly faces, and a strong sense of community, it was the kind of place people moved to escape chaos, a sanctuary where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. But that illusion of safety would be shattered on that autumn morning. By daybreak, the peace of Elmwood Avenue would give way to police sirens, hushed whispers, and a tragedy so profound it would leave the town reeling for years to come. If you are not an advocate of violence, murder, child abuse, to mention a few, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more true crime stories. Thank you. At the center of it all was the Anderson family. Their home, a pristine two-story colonial with its perfectly trimmed hedges and inviting porch, had always seemed like the epitome of suburban bliss. Susan Anderson, 39 years old, was the face of neighborhood charm. A devoted mother of two and an active member of the local PTA, Susan was someone people trusted. Always quick with a warm smile, she was well-liked, well-respected, and seemingly content. But appearances can be deceiving. Beneath that polished exterior, Susan was grappling with a growing emptiness, a restlessness she couldn't quite name, but one she would soon act on in ways no one could have predicted. Her husband, Mark Anderson, was equally admired. A hard-working financial advisor, he spent long hours commuting to Manhattan to provide for his family. Mark's colleagues described him as focused and driven, while his neighbors saw him as reliable, always willing to lend a hand when needed. Together, Susan and Mark seemed like the perfect couple, but perfection, as we know, is often a facade, and in the Andersons' case, that facade was beginning to crack. Across the street lived Caleb Miller, a 17-year-old high school senior with an infectious smile and a bright future ahead of him. Caleb was the type of kid who could charm anyone, teachers, friends, even the older residents of the neighborhood. He was known for being helpful, mowing lawns, shoveling snow, and running errands for those who needed it. Susan Anderson had always been fond of Caleb, seeing him as a sweet, polite young man. Over time, their friendly chats turned into longer conversations. What started as harmless banter soon evolved into something far more dangerous, a connection that neither of them fully understood but neither was willing to stop. Their affair began innocently enough. A passing compliment here, a lingering glance there. But the attraction between them grew, fueled by secrecy and the thrill of the forbidden. Susan, feeling stifled in her routine life, found herself drawn to Caleb's youthful energy and admiration. Caleb, in turn, was captivated by Susan's attention. She made him feel special, important, feelings he wasn't used to, and so what should have been an impossible relationship slowly took root, hidden in plain sight. For months, the affair remained their secret. They exchanged texts late at night, careful to delete them before anyone could see. They found excuses to meet when no one else was around, brief encounters that felt like stolen moments of freedom. But as their relationship deepened, the risks grew. Neighbors began to notice Susan spending more time outside, often looking distracted. Caleb's parents, while unaware of the full truth, started questioning why their son was so preoccupied. And Mark Anderson, though often away at work, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By early October, the tension in the Anderson household was palpable. Mark had confronted Susan about her increasingly distant behavior, but she brushed off his concerns, blaming stress and exhaustion. Caleb, meanwhile, was struggling to keep his emotions in check. The secrecy was wearing on him, and he began to crave more of Susan's time and attention, more than she could give. What had once been a thrilling escape now felt like a ticking time bomb, and neither Susan nor Caleb knew how to defuse it. Then came the night of October 14th. The air was crisp, the streets quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. Inside the Anderson home, an argument erupted. Mark had found something. A cryptic text message on Susan's phone, vague enough to raise questions but not enough to confirm his worst fears. The confrontation was heated, voices carrying through the walls as Susan tried to deflect and Mark demanded answers. It was during this argument that Caleb showed up, unannounced and unaware of the chaos unfolding inside. This is the true story of Susan Anderson, Caleb Miller, and Mark Anderson, A story of love, obsession, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of secrets kept for too long. Caleb Miller was no stranger to the Anderson home. For years, he had been the neighborhood's go-to helper, assisting with yard work, moving heavy furniture, or watching the Anderson children when Susan needed an extra hand. On the surface, it was nothing unusual. A teenager earning pocket money, a neighborly bond built over trust. But as the summer of 2018 gave way to autumn, something shifted. At first, it was just small talk, conversations about school, life in Maplewood, and Caleb's plans for the future. Susan would pour him a glass of lemonade after a long afternoon of raking leaves, and they'd chat on the back porch. Caleb admired Susan's confidence, the way she seemed to have her life together. And Susan, though she might not have admitted it to herself, began to look forward to Caleb's visits in a way that went beyond mere friendship. It was during one of these casual afternoons that the dynamic began to change. Caleb was helping Susan carry a box of decorations up from the basement when his hand brushed against hers. It was a fleeting moment, so quick it could have been nothing, but the glance they exchanged lingered. Neither said anything, but something unspoken passed between them, a flicker of curiosity, of possibility. Soon their conversations grew longer, more personal. Caleb confided in Susan about the pressure he felt to succeed, the expectations placed on him by his parents. Susan, in turn, shared bits of her own frustrations, how Mark's long hours at work left her feeling isolated, how she sometimes felt invisible in her own home. They found solace in each other, a connection that felt safe but was anything but. One evening, as the sun set over the quiet neighborhood, Caleb stayed longer than usual to help Susan trim the hedges in the backyard. The children were inside watching television, and the house was otherwise still. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. As they worked side by side, their laughter broke the silence, each joke and teasing comment drawing them closer together. And then, in the shadow of the garden, the boundary was crossed. Whispers turned into glances, glances into lingering touches, and finally into a kiss that neither of them could take back. That kiss marked the beginning of a secret they would both fight to protect. At first, their meetings were sporadic, cloaked in the guise of harmless errands. Caleb would stop by to drop off groceries or help Susan with the car, and no one thought twice about it. But as weeks turned into months, their relationship grew more intense. They began meeting in places where they wouldn't be seen, quiet corners of the park, the back of Caleb's car, and even the empty Anderson house when Mark was away at work. Their stolen moments were charged with a mixture of exhilaration and fear. Susan was careful, deleting messages and making excuses to explain her absences. Caleb, though younger, was no less cautious, lying to his parents about where he was going and why. But no matter how careful they tried to be, the cracks in their facade began to show. Neighbors started noticing Caleb spending more time at the Andersons than seemed normal for a teenager. Mark, though distracted by work, couldn't ignore Susan's sudden change in demeanor. She seemed happier, more vibrant, but also more distracted, her phone always within reach, her moods shifting unpredictably. At school, Caleb's friends joked about his frequent errands, but even they started to wonder why he was so secretive. The affair was no longer just a private escape. It was becoming harder to contain, a fire threatening to burn through the fragile walls they had built around it. Susan and Caleb both knew the risks. They knew what they were doing was wrong. But by then, it was too late to turn back. Desire had given way to dependency, and the thought of losing what they had, however fleeting, was too much to bear. At what point did their actions cross the line? Was it the first kiss? The first time they lied to those they loved? Or was it the moment they decided to keep going, even as the weight of their secret grew heavier by the day? And could anyone have seen the signs before it was too late? These are questions that would haunt the town of Maplewood long after the tragedy unfolded. The tension in the Anderson household was becoming palpable. Mark sensed something was wrong but couldn't put his finger on it. Susan's demeanor shifted between warmth and distance, leaving him confused and frustrated. Caleb, meanwhile, was finding it harder to keep his emotions in check. He wanted more of Susan's time, more of her attention, but her life, her responsibilities made that impossible. And so, what had once felt like an escape now began to feel like a trap for them both. By late October, the fabric of Susan and Caleb's secret world had begun to unravel, thread by thread. What started as small, seemingly insignificant details slowly began to pile up, each one a clue that something wasn't right. And no one was more attuned to these changes than Mark Anderson. Mark had always trusted Susan. Their marriage, though not without its challenges, had been built on a foundation of mutual respect, or so he thought. But over the past few months, that foundation had started to crack. Susan's phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter, was now always in her hand or tucked away in her purse. She had become distant, her attention often elsewhere even during family dinners. And then there were the late-night outings, excuses about errands that didn't quite add up, long walks she claimed were for clearing her mind. It was one of these late-night outings that first planted a seed of doubt in Mark's mind. Susan had gone out to pick up some groceries, but when she returned, she carried no bags. Mark didn't press her on it at the time, but his curiosity was piqued. That night, as Susan slept, he picked up her phone, hoping to find answers. What he found was a trail of deleted messages, text threads that ended abruptly, timestamps that suggested conversations had taken place but left no visible trace. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Mark suspicious. Over the next few days, Mark started to pay closer attention. He noticed the way Susan's eyes lingered on her phone, the way she seemed nervous whenever it buzzed. And then, one evening, he found something more damning. A single text message that Susan had forgotten to delete. It was short, just a simple, "I miss you too," but it was enough to confirm his worst fears. He didn't recognize the number, but he didn't need to. His mind was already spinning, piecing together the fragments of a betrayal he hadn't wanted to see. When Mark confronted Susan, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over. The confrontation was explosive, their voices echoing through the house. Mark demanded answers, his anger fueled by hurt and disbelief. Susan, caught off guard, tried to deflect, but her excuses only fanned the flames. "Who is it?" Mark shouted, his face red with fury. "Who have you been texting?" Susan denied everything at first, but her hesitation betrayed her. She couldn't meet his eyes, couldn't offer a convincing lie, and Mark, in his heart, already knew the truth. Their arguments became a nightly occurrence, each one more heated than the last. Mark's suspicions consumed him, and Susan's guilt left her defensive and fragile. The cracks in their marriage, once hidden behind a facade of suburban normalcy, were now wide open for anyone to see, and it wasn't just their household that felt the strain. The whispers had started in the neighborhood, subtle at first, but growing louder with each passing day. Susan's late-night outings hadn't gone unnoticed, nor had Caleb's frequent visits to the Anderson home. What was once their secret had become everyone's scandal. The Millers were among the first to hear the rumors. Caleb's parents, Diane and Robert Miller, were proud of their son and had always believed in his potential. But when whispers of his involvement with Susan reached their ears, their pride turned to shock and anger. Diane was the first to confront Caleb, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Is it true?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for a denial that didn't come. Caleb, caught between his emotions and the weight of his actions, couldn't bring himself to lie. His silence was answer enough. The confrontation in the Miller household was no less volatile than the one across the street. Diane was furious, her voice rising with each question. "How could you do this?" "She's a married woman, Caleb." Robert, though quieter, was no less angry. "You're throwing your future away," he said, his tone heavy with disappointment. Caleb tried to explain, to defend his feelings for Susan, but his words only deepened their frustration. Diane, desperate to put an end to the situation, warned him to stay away from Susan. But Caleb, blinded by his emotions, refused to listen. As the tension mounted, threats began to fly. Robert, in a rare outburst, threatened to confront Susan himself if Caleb didn't end things. Diane considered reaching out to Mark, hoping that exposing the affair might force it to stop. But Caleb begged them not to, insisting that they didn't understand, that he loved Susan and couldn't just walk away. His defiance only widened the rift between him and his parents, leaving the Miller household fractured and on edge. It was the night of November 12th, 2018, when the storm that had been brewing in the Anderson household finally broke. The day had been unremarkable. A gray, overcast sky blanketing Maplewood, an unseasonal chill in the air. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the rain had begun to fall in sheets, hammering against the windows and washing over the quiet streets. But inside the Anderson home, a storm far more volatile was about to erupt. Mark Anderson had spent the evening brooding, piecing together the puzzle that had haunted him for weeks. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, and every small clue, the deleted messages, Susan's evasive answers, Caleb's lingering presence, pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Tonight, he decided, there would be no more evasions, no more lies. He would confront Susan once and for all, demand the truth, and force her to choose between her family and whatever it was she had with that boy. Susan, on the other hand, had spent the day in a state of growing anxiety. Caleb's defiance of his parents had alarmed her. He had called her earlier, his voice trembling with frustration. "They don't understand," he had said. "They want me to stay away from you, but I can't, Susan. I won't." She had tried to calm him, to reassure him that everything would be fine, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their carefully constructed secret was crumbling around them. That night, as the rain lashed against the windows, she paced the living room, waiting for Mark to return from work, dreading the confrontation she knew was inevitable. What she didn't know was that Caleb was already on his way. Despite the storm, despite his parents' warnings, he had slipped out of the house, driven by a reckless determination to see her. The streets were slick with rain, the headlights of his car cutting through the darkness as he sped toward the Anderson home. He didn't know what he planned to say or do when he got there. He just knew he had to see her. Mark arrived home first, slamming the door behind him and startling Susan out of her thoughts. She barely had time to greet him before he launched into the confrontation she had been dreading. His voice was low but charged with anger as he demanded answers. "I know, Susan," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "I know about you and Caleb." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, louder than the storm outside. Susan's denial was immediate but unconvincing. Her voice shook, her excuses faltered, and Mark's anger erupted. "Don't lie to me," he shouted, his fists clenched at his sides. "How long has this been going on?" The argument grew louder, more heated, their voices echoing through the house. Mark's accusations cut deep, and Susan's defenses crumbled under the weight of her guilt. She tried to explain, to justify what had happened, but nothing she said could quell Mark's rage. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and out of control. And then, just as the argument reached its peak, the sound of the doorbell cut through the tension. Susan froze, her breath catching in her throat. She knew who it was before she even opened the door. Caleb stood on the porch, soaked to the bone, his face a mix of determination and desperation. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain. Before Susan could respond, Mark appeared behind her. His expression, already furious, darkened even further at the sight of Caleb. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Mark demanded that Caleb leave, his voice rising with each word. Caleb, emboldened by his emotions, refused to back down. "I love her," he shouted, his voice cracking with the weight of his confession. The words hit Mark like a physical blow, his anger boiling over into something far more dangerous. He turned on Susan, his voice shaking with fury. "Is this what you wanted?" he demanded. "To ruin our family for this?" At some point, a kitchen knife was drawn. Whether it was Mark or Caleb who grabbed it first, no one can say for certain. What is known is that in the chaos, the knife found its mark, a single desperate thrust and then silence. Susan's scream pierced the air, louder than the storm outside. Caleb staggered backward, his hands clutching his abdomen, blood seeping through his fingers. He collapsed to the floor, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Mark stood frozen, the knife still in his hand, his expression one of horror as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. Susan dropped to her knees beside Caleb, her hands trembling as she tried to stop the bleeding, her sobs choking her words. The storm outside may have subsided, but within the walls of the Anderson home, the aftermath of that fateful night was just beginning. As Susan sat on the floor, her hands stained with Caleb's blood. The sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder with each passing second. The flashing lights painted the walls in shades of red and blue, a stark reminder that the events of the night could never be undone. When the officers entered the house, they found a scene of utter devastation: shattered glass, overturned furniture, and 3 lives irreparably broken. Mark was taken into custody without resistance. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he tried to explain what had happened. "It was an accident," he said over and over, his voice hollow. But his words did little to clarify the chaos. When the case went to trial, the courtroom was packed with reporters, spectators, and the families of both the victim and the accused. Mark himself took the stand, his voice shaking as he recounted the events of that night. "I didn't mean to hurt him," he said, his eyes brimming with tears. "I just wanted him to leave." Susan's testimony was perhaps the most emotional of all. She described the affair in painful detail, acknowledging her mistakes and expressing deep remorse for the pain she had caused her family and Caleb's. Her voice broke as she described the moment Caleb collapsed, the life draining from his eyes. "I couldn't save him," she said, her hands trembling as she wiped away tears, "and I'll never forgive myself for what happened." Mark was sentenced to 15 years in prison, a sentence that sparked mixed reactions from the community. Some believed it was too lenient, given the loss of a young life. Others saw it as a fair acknowledgement of the complex emotions and circumstances that had led to the tragedy. In the weeks and months that followed, the Anderson home was put up for sale, a somber reminder of the events that had unfolded within its walls. Susan moved away, seeking a fresh start far from the whispers and stares of her neighbors. The Millers, too, struggled to rebuild their lives, their grief compounded by the public nature of their son's death. Maplewood slowly returned to its quiet routine, but the scars of that night remained, etched into the memories of everyone who had been touched by the tragedy. As the years passed, the story of the Andersons and the Millers became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how fragile the bonds of trust and love can be. If you are not an advocate of violence, murder, child abuse, to mention a few, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more true crime stories. Thank you.